The Lobito Corridor is also hailed or touted as a case where dependence on China can be reduced. Lobito Port and the Benguela Railway, these have already been rehabilitated by the Chinese. The locomotives for the railways, it actually comes from China, the anchor investor for the railway line. It's a mine which is a joint venture between a Canadian firm and a Chinese firm. If you're talking about the demand for these critical minerals or critical raw materials, it's again in China because that's where they are doing the refining.
Hello, this is Chloe Teevan, and this is Europolis, the Global Europe podcast. Europe's concerns around competitiveness and security of value chains are growing, and critical raw materials have become a key concern in powering the green industrial revolution that it is hoped will come. So today I'm joined by my colleague, Poorva Karkare, Senior Policy Analyst with ECDPM and an expert on industrialisation and regional integration in Africa. So many of these critical raw materials, such as lithium, cobalt and graphite, are crucial to the green transition, powering electric car batteries, photovoltaics and other key technologies such as magnets. They're also crucial to many key digital technologies, including notably to the chips that power just about everything, and are now being bought up in voracious quantities to power vast data centres as the artificial intelligence race continues to rage. So in this context, the EU has developed the Critical Raw Materials Act. Can you maybe talk a little bit about the key concerns that the EU tries to tackle in terms of value chain security with the CRMA?
Thanks, Chloe. I think before getting into what the CRMA actually talks about, it's good to have some kind of context as to where it comes from. So critical raw materials, as you said, they are crucial for these technologies, but the criticality comes not just from the role they play in these technologies that you mentioned, but also because of the fact that they are susceptible to certain kinds of shocks. Now, these shocks could be out of geopolitics. So today we're talking about the weaponization of dependence on China, that China could come up with some kind of export bans or restrictions, and that then has an impact on how these technologies are accessible to other countries. And there's a growing realization in the EU that you cannot depend on just the one country for these minerals. But other than that, there can also be shocks. I mean, if you can think back to 5 years ago, when COVID happened, you did see supply chains basically come to a standstill, right? And if I look at the current state of international cooperation, I think it's only a question of when rather than whether the next pandemic will happen. So from that perspective, maybe it's a good thing that Europe is also thinking about this. And it is also, the point I was trying to make was, it's also during COVID that this whole idea of strategic autonomy started coming in. And it didn't start necessarily with critical raw materials, but basically to try and have the capacity to produce PPE, the protective equipment that we needed back when the pandemic was raging here. So that's kind of the thinking on the European side, let's say on the West side. But then we also need to think about what's happening in developing countries. And that's where these critical raw materials are found, at least a large part of them. And there, I think the point is more that until now, under the neoliberal kind of advice and policies that they had in these countries, they focused mostly on this idea of comparative advantage. And so it just made a lot of sense for them to just export these raw materials. But now they look at China, just as in Europe, we're looking at China as some kind of a competitor or even a rival. In developing countries, they look at China and then they think, right, this is what we need. We need economic growth and development. That's kind of the hard truth. And in order to do that, they can't be going only by market forces and according to the comparative advantage, but actually looking at their competitive advantage. And this is something that needs to be created. You need the state for that. You need industrial policies for that. And that's what they're trying to do. And looking at critical raw materials, their thinking is, well, we need to add value to these raw materials before we export them to these minerals. And that's also why they call them not critical raw materials, but actually strategic minerals, because that's the strategic value for their development. And so they've also been putting in place what has been, I would say, quite controversially called resource nationalist policies. I actually wrote a paper about this, where they put in place some kind of export bans just to make sure that they have these value addition activities happening before they export the minerals. I don't think it's the best way to go about it. You can find out in my paper why I say so. But so this is kind of the context in which the EU then introduced the Critical Raw Materials Act. And what does the Act do? It has these soft targets where they're looking at annual consumption of these critical raw materials, and then they're saying, right, 10% of the extraction of these materials needs to happen within the EU. Then they say 40% needs to be processed in the EU. 25% needs to be recycled. And then there's an additional target which says that they won't depend on any one country for more than 65% of these critical raw materials. Now, this last bit is very clearly towards China, right? Yeah. Because China has this dominant role. But I think the different proportions also hint to the fact that the EU realizes very much they won't be able to do it by themselves, because there's not that many critical raw materials within Europe. I mean, there's all sorts of exploration happening, but at this point in time, they need to depend on these partner countries, which also means these partner countries are interested in value addition. And that is why the Critical Raw Materials Act also has a clause which talks about value addition in partner countries. So you had these strategic projects that were introduced to try and look at how they can do value addition in partner countries.
That's a very good segue, I guess, into what we would like to talk about today, which is really this question of, partnerships around critical raw materials and what those entail. And this is something that you've been working quite a lot on, as you've already somewhat alluded to. A lot of your work has really explored, well, what tangible actions can the EU take in Africa in order to develop these partnerships around critical raw materials. And in particular, there's been a lot of discussion in Europe about the Lobito Corridor linking Zambia and the DRC to the port of Lobito in Angola. But I guess the question I have for you is really, what is the EU actually doing around the Lobito Corridor? And what are some of the expectations from the African states? You've already alluded to some of those, but it would be interesting to dig into that a little bit further.
So I think this is quite a broad question, and I won't be able to tell you, I will be able to tell you what the EU is doing specifically, but I think, again, it helps to have sort of a snapshot, because this is a very complex picture, and there's quite a bit of confusion in terms of what we're talking about exactly. So maybe I will divide my answer in 4 different things. So the Lobito Corridor is about the infrastructure, because it's about the railway. It's about mining. It's also about other use cases for using the railway line. And finally, it's also about reducing dependence on China, which we already talked about a bit. One side note, though, in Europe or in the EU, we're talking a lot about the EU doing things in the Lobito Corridor. But we wrote a paper about this, and I would really urge your listeners to go have a look at the paper. There's a lot more details there. But one of the things that we realized was that in the corridor countries, it's the US that is talked about much, much more than the EU. Things are changing now with the Trump administration. Now the EU is really getting more attention, but until about a few months ago, it was definitely much more the US that was being talked about. Anyway, so the 4 things that I was talking about, the first is infrastructure, and this is where some of the confusion comes in. So the Lobito Corridor, there is an existing railway line. That's what you call the brownfield railway line, which connects the port of Lobito to the coal mining region in the DRC, around Kolwezi. Now, this railway line goes back to the colonial times, and then it was destroyed during the Angolan Civil War. The Chinese have already rehabilitated it on the Angolan side. What's now left is rehabilitating it on the DRC side. It's a stretch of 400 kilometers or something, and then also doing some kind of upgrades on the Angolan side. On top of that, there is also claims of building a greenfield railway line, which is a brand new railway line that's going to be laid out, connecting the copper belt in Zambia with the Lobito port. Now there's a lot of questions in terms of, is there enough demand? How long is it going to be? How much is it going to cost, etc.? So there's still a lot of questions about its viability. I won't get into the details about it. So yeah, there's the two railway lines, and then you also have roads connecting to the Lobito port. So, there's when you talk about the Lobito Corridor, you always have to say, yeah, okay, which one exactly are you talking about? So that's one thing. Second is about mining. Now, one of the main reasons why Lobito Corridor becomes so interesting is because it also provides some kind of supply chain security, not just to the US, but also to Europe, with regards to critical raw materials, right? You have copper and cobalt in the copper belt. But there the question is, fine, the Lobito Corridor now sort of enables export of minerals through the western coast of Africa rather than the eastern coast, where most of the minerals are now going, through Dar es Salaam or through Durban in the southern coast. But there's also a question about, well, what happens after you take these minerals out of the coast of Africa, right? Because you can't use these minerals as they are to produce your magnets and EV batteries. You need to refine them. And does the EU have the capacity to refine these CRMs? I think the short answer is no. Then you can ask yourself, does the EU have the capacity to assist and help the African countries, so DRC and Zambia, to refine these minerals? Even there, my answer would be not really. So then, you need to think about critical raw materials as a whole value chain. It's not just about accessing critical raw materials per se.
Okay, so this is very interesting, and I think we will get back to this point about why the EU can't currently refine these minerals and why it can't actually help the partner countries yet either, because I think this is a really central question in terms of the CRMA and what the EU actually aspires to do. But maybe for now, short term, what can the EU actually do along the Lobito Corridor? Why invest in the Lobito Corridor short term?
So actually, that would be the third thing I wanted to talk about, which is other use cases for the corridor. So right now, the railway line is being used to transport minerals that are coming out of the DRC. But you can also use the railway line for other things, so like agriculture, or have energy so that you can use that energy to produce other goods, which can then use the railway line. But even there's a few things to be considered. For instance, if you're talking about agriculture, it's a great thing if agriculture can be developed in this part of the continent, because the land is very fertile and you also have job creation opportunities and you develop these secondary cities, etc., so that not everything is concentrated in capitals. But there the question becomes, how do you transport the produce that you have? Because on the railway line, the wagons that you're using to transport, say, your copper or cobalt, you're not going to use the same wagons to transport fresh produce. And the railway consortium that's operating the railway line right now are not interested in looking at anything beyond minerals at this point in time, because they're not sure about the demand. So this is where you get into the very known typical chicken and egg problem. So is it that you have to develop agriculture first and then the railway opportunities will come along, or do you have to open up the railway line to transport these things and then these things will start developing? So that's the stage that you are at. And then about energy, I would say, just to give a small example, when we did the research, we found out that EU has signed an agreement with Zambia where they're providing financing for different things. One of them, there's about 30 million euros that they are giving for rehabilitation of the Kariba Dam. Now, this is the main source for Zambia's hydroelectric power. That's great because you do need to, keep up the dam and repair it, etc., etc. But then there's a question in terms of, should the EU not be also investing in greenfield projects? Because actually, this country, any country in Africa needs a lot of electricity. So, can the EU also get into greenfield projects? Because that's how you also enhance Zambia's capacity to produce more electricity. So, that's just one observation that I have. And then the fourth thing that I wanted to tell you about the Lobito Corridor is also dependence on China. So the Lobito Corridor is also hailed or touted as a case where dependence on China can be reduced. And from our research, it seems this is probably the weakest link. Because if you think about Lobito Port and the Benguela Railway, these have already been rehabilitated by the Chinese. Okay, it's being operated now by a consortium of mostly European firms. Even there, one of the consortium partners actually has Chinese shareholding. But okay, leave that aside. Then, if you're talking about the railway itself, the locomotives for the railways, it actually comes from China. If you're talking about the anchor investment, the anchor investor for the railway line, like that's the one that gives the guarantee that there's going to be enough demand for the railway. It's a mine, which is a joint venture between a Canadian firm and a Chinese firm. If you're talking about the demand for these critical minerals or critical raw materials, it's again in China because that's where they are doing the refining. So, in all respects, China is very prominently involved.
Getting China out of the picture is going to be very, very, very complicated, right? And ultimately, that is something that you've written about as well recently. I'm so glad that we get to talk about all of these. You have built this body of work around CRMs and around different aspects, and so I think it's really interesting to delve into this a little bit. But one of the latest pieces that you wrote really argued that realistically the EU cannot necessarily develop secure CRM value chains without exploring some kind of partnership with China in the short term, or at least looking for strategic complementarities with China. So can you elaborate a little bit further on this? And this maybe also gets a little bit to the point that you previously raised, that right now Europe cannot refine these minerals and doesn't have much capacity to help partner countries either.
I think until now, we've probably already established that the EU will need partners, right? It will need to work with countries, whether it's in Africa or Latin America or wherever, to access raw materials in the first place. And it will also have to depend on China because they are doing the refining of these minerals. I think where it gets tricky is until recently, Europe had the technological prowess and China had the manufacturing prowess. But when it comes to now clean technologies, Europe's technological leadership has been lost. So it's difficult to compete with China on both fronts, technological and manufacturing. And let's not forget, EU is suffering from really, really high energy prices, right? And you need a lot of energy to actually refine these minerals. And also square this now with the fact that China's presence in partner countries in Africa or wherever is quite dominant. So how are you going to bypass China altogether? So that's why I think competing one-on-one against China is probably not very realistic. But then the EU has a chance. Well, a chance, I think, is not the right word, but the EU can actually draw a leaf out of China's own playbook to enhance their capacity. So one thing that we have learned there is, China, you need to think about critical raw materials as a whole value chain, like I explained just before. You need to think about who's going to process and then how you use it for downstream activities. And you need a lot of financing, competitive financing, affordable financing. In other words, you need dedicated industrial policy to do this. But more fundamentally, I think the point is that EU strategic autonomy does not have to mean that the EU does it all alone. So there is a way for the EU to actually work with partner countries who have their own priorities to add value and not shun China. I forgot to mention this when you asked what African priorities are. They do not want to be caught in this kind of game of choosing one side or the other. So there is a way for the EU to work with these countries and work with China in these countries in order to reduce the EU's own dependence on China. So hold on, bear with me for a bit. Think about it. In the Lobito Corridor, let's take the Lobito Corridor as an example. You have the EU trying to access critical raw materials, but then they realize they don't have the capacity to refine them. But what if the EU were to actually leverage their market, which is kind of the main point of attraction for China as well, right? It's the EU's market. But what if the EU were to leverage this Critical Raw Materials Act by saying, they're going to put in restrictions on imports coming directly from China once it surpasses the 65% or at any threshold that you want, but leverage that restriction in order to incentivize Chinese firms to move some of their operations to African countries. So Chinese companies actually go to the DRC and to Zambia to actually refine these minerals before exporting them. And exporting them where? Exporting them to the EU so that you also link that export from Africa to Europe with another project, possibly with another Chinese firm, to try and produce downstream battery cells in Europe. If you do this, I'm not by any stretch of the imagination saying that this is easy, but I do think we need to think outside the box like this. And if we want to be ambitious, let's be ambitious in a way that we think that it's possible somehow. And if we do this, I really think that you get all partners somewhat happy or satisfied. You get African countries having value addition in their countries before they export. You have the EU getting access to refined minerals, and they don't have to worry about high price of energy. Maybe they can keep the energy concerns that they have for other sectors. And China still retains access to the EU market, but then the EU also has its strategic autonomy in a sense. So that's how I thought we could think about it.
Well, it's really a question of tackling some of the dependencies and having, I guess, instead of having the entire value chain based in China, you are at least, in a sense, bringing the value chain closer to home, albeit still having certain dependencies on Chinese companies.
Exactly.
But it makes me think of, I've just finished Apple in China, which really explores how Chinese companies, little by little, kind of took over the whole value chain and learned so much from Apple. And in a sense, you're also saying that the Europeans should maybe also, by partnering with Chinese companies that have the expertise in this area, that they could, in a sense, also learn from the Chinese and play more and more of a role in those value chains. So it's
exactly
a kind of interesting example of learning from China ultimately. And I guess, as you say, it's really about shifting towards an industrial policy way of thinking, which the Chinese have been doing for a long time.
Precisely.
Maybe one other area that you've worked on recently and that I think is really quite fascinating, and that relates to this question of, how do you actually support refining these minerals within Africa, is you've done work recently on skills and processes in the case of aluminium in Guinea. And so can you tell us a little bit more about the work that you did in Guinea and how the EU can be more involved in this space when it comes to kind of upskilling and playing a role in developing these value chains locally in African contexts?
Yeah, it was a very interesting project. And I think upskilling, that is one of the pillars even of the Global Gateway, right? So that's why we thought it would be interesting to work on this project. The genesis is basically a French firm wanting to set up an alumina refinery in Guinea. So you basically refine bauxite into alumina, and then you smelt alumina to make aluminum. So they want to set up an alumina refinery in Guinea. And on the face of it, it's very strategic for the EU because aluminum is one of the critical raw materials mentioned in the list that the EU has. And also gallium, which is a byproduct of bauxite mining and is the second critical raw material that is mentioned in the EU's list. And actually, if you see recently, China had restrictions on gallium exports. So this could be very, very strategic for the EU if you think about the CRMA. And what's nice about it is that this squarely falls or addresses the priorities of a partner country, Guinea, where they've been talking about value addition if you do refining. To add cherry on top, the French firm that wants to set up the refinery also wants to do the upscaling through this new school that they're going to set up. So this is like a perfect, almost a fairy tale, right? Everyone gets what they want. But obviously, no, is the short answer. As we were working on this project, the whole project was trying to think about, right, even if this rhetoric or narrative makes sense, just as I laid out a while earlier on how the EU can work with China, there's so many nuts and bolts that need to work in practical terms before these complementarities can come out. Maybe for your listeners, I mean, I won't get into the details of what some of these nuts and bolts were from the perspective of Guinea, but maybe let's focus on the EU. Main thing is, if you think of this project as being strategic, then the question of skills also becomes strategic, right? But then if you look at the instruments that the EU has at their disposal, they tend to be very development cooperation focused. So just to explain this a bit further, if you look at the EU delegation in Guinea, what they are doing, they have a program that looks at skills and employability, but then they're looking at small and medium enterprises. Now, these small and medium enterprises are not going to become any kind of serious suppliers to the refinery. Because at this point, you see, the refinery is only going to employ about 800 people. And if Guinea's government, I should have mentioned this before, if Guinean government plays their cards right and does industrial policy in a way to also create a class of suppliers to the refinery, you're talking about thousands in terms of job creation. Because the goods and services that the refinery needs, you need a lot many things there. So coming back to this point, so the delegation in Guinea, they're looking at SMEs. They're not going to be very serious suppliers. The delegation is also not looking at mining, and the delegation is the program that they are running with GIZ, Enable, and others. Also doesn't have any activities in the mining region where the refinery is going to be located. So they're not looking at the right level, nor sector, nor geography. I mean, this might also be a bit unfair because you see, these programs have been carved out a while ago. I mean, we're talking about CRMs. This only started coming into vogue in like 2021 or thereabouts.
And we've also seen a real shift in terms
Exactly.
of the entire narrative around working with developing countries. This is a big shift from the previous narrative around development cooperation, which was
where mining was even
very
a
different.
dirty word, right? They did not want to get into mining in the first place. But that's why I'm saying, I mean, it's unfair, but it's also true that changing these things with the EU machinery just takes a lot of time. And so you almost have to think about it from the perspective of the French firm, right, that wants to set up this school, because they can run the school for, say, 2-3 years until the refinery is up and running. But after that, they don't want to run the school. Why should they? Because they're a private company, not a philanthropy. So they are looking for partners who can take up and continue running the school because they're going to set up the equipment, the teachers, etc. So I can totally understand and sympathize that, on the EU side, it takes time to change these things, but I can also understand the position that the French firm is in. And so this is what's happening at the EU delegation level in Guinea. You come to Brussels, and then you have this. They have this Team Europe initiative called the OPVET. And in the report that we wrote, we also write about many things in terms of what some of the shortcomings are. But like one that comes to mind immediately is they have a call for proposal, where they ask companies to write a proposal, and then they select a few companies who they think are really important. These are the private investments that the EU wants to support, etc., etc. But again, thinking about it from the perspective of the firm, this is a firm that is under a lot of pressure, also from the Guinean government, obviously, because they want to set up the refinery as soon as possible, employ the people as soon as possible, so that the government also can show that here is something that we managed to do. And so in that kind of context, it just seems very unlikely that a firm is going to set time aside, write a proposal, submit it, for which decision will be made maybe 8 months, 9 months down the line. And the result is going to be a pot of financing, which in the end is not going to be attractive enough for the firm in the first place, because the EU is not supporting just this one project, but several others. So there's still questions around. I mean, there's no easy answers for what the right instrument would be, but this is not necessarily the best one suited for the purpose. So if you want to do really opportunity-driven TVET, there has to be some other things being taken into account.
This is really, I guess, points to a lot of our research at ECDPM and to the challenges that we're seeing in terms of this shift in narrative, actually, and the focus now with the Global Gateway on investments and strategic partnerships with Global South countries, because whilst there's this narrative which is very, very ambitious, ultimately when you go to the delegations, when you go to the partner countries and you actually look at what the delegations are actually capable of doing, you do find that indeed many of the instruments are not actually fit for purpose, that the personnel were hired initially to do completely different work from what they're now doing, and that there is this shift. With this shift towards private sector engagement, there are also a lot of staff who are officially kind of policy officers who are being actually one staff member in the EU delegation said we're really now being asked to be kind of investment officers, or to help to direct investments, which is not at all what we were initially hired for or trained for. So I think you get at something that is much more fundamental, and that we're noticing in so much of our work at ECDPM, and that I think we will also get into with other colleagues in the months ahead, looking at other topics. But thank you again, Poorva, for sharing your time today. This was a really, really interesting conversation, and I look forward to many other stimulating conversations.
Thank you so much for having me.